Greenbelt Advisory Board meeting. We now have a quorum, and it is 10 o'clock, so we'll get underway. If we could get an approval for the meeting notes of January 12th.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
So moved. And moving on to comments from the public. Do we have anyone this morning? No? Okay. All right. That's easy. So now we're going straight into the Greenbelt program update. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a reminder, all of our meetings are being live streamed on the county's YouTube channel. And then jumping right into the program update. We still have several pending closings, with one of those, Pappy's Island 2, scheduled for February 15th, which is next week, and we are on target for that one. County Council on February 1st did accept your recommendation to approve the Silver Hill Plantation transfer request for that conservation easement from East Cooper Land Trust to Low Country Land Trust. And then our current application cycle, we ended up receiving 9 total applications, 3 of those urban, 6 of those rural, and they will come before the full GAB on April 6th. And then the subcommittee will meet next month in March in 2 meetings to review those applications and make recommendations on those.
That sounds good. Yeah, please carry on.
Okay.
And let me just say here, as we jump into the 5-year review update, these topics we're about to touch on, it is not imperative today that we come to any conclusion. These are just for introduction's sake. If it is obvious we can come to a pretty quick conclusion on one, that's fine, because that would get it out of the way. But this is mostly an introduction for what will be a year-end document on the whole thing. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No problem, sir. Structures and impervious surfaces. At the last meeting, we introduced the concept to you with a rough outline of what that matrix might be for setting impervious surface limits for fee simple properties. And the suggestion was made to contact Chuck Flink with Greenways Inc. for some feedback on what we were considering. And we were able to go ahead and contact Chuck, and he put together a research paper for us titled Review of Best Practices for Impervious Surfaces. This is the outline of the document. It was sent out to you last week, so you could review that in advance. Last month we covered pretty in depth what impervious surfaces are, why we care about those. Then Chuck also researched national and state standards for impervious surface limits, and there really are none that are across the board as far as this is a percentage that you're allowed. There's none statewide, there's no national, which takes us to the meat of his report, which are best practices, and those involved case studies with what I'm calling peer programs. So I'll run through those and summarize each peer program and how they might handle impervious surfaces. First off, there were a few peer programs that formally do implement standard impervious surface limits across the board. It's kind of piecemeal from what I could tell. He did ask a question to all of these agencies, and that question was, does your community apply an impervious surface limit on development within open space, parks, or greenbelt lands? And then also, do you have a limit on how much impervious surface can be constructed within your open space? And just running through these in the order that they appeared in Chuck's paper. The first was Arapahoe County open space in Colorado. They don't do anything themselves. They rely on the local stormwater authority that has fairly stringent impervious surface limits. Wake County open space up in North Carolina seems to handle these on a case-by-case basis, as well as, again, there's local water supply watersheds that have certain impervious surface limits. So when one of their properties falls under that, they follow those requirements. Chicago Open Lands, their response was that they expect all of the properties that they're involved in to have less than 1% of impervious surface, but it's nothing formal, and that's not actually recorded. It's not a recorded requirement. Montgomery County Legacy Open Space Program. They are regional parks, which I took to be like a Charleston County Parks and Rec Commission park, like James Island or one of those larger regional parks. They do require that those maintain 2/3 of the acreage in natural areas condition. So nothing specific to impervious surfaces, but it's how they define natural areas condition. And then they also have special protection areas within their program that caps their impervious surface limit at 6%. The next is Portland Metro Parks, Open Space and Trails. They don't have a standard impervious surface cap, but they do estimate that only 3 to 5% of their sites that they're involved in are actually developed. Mecklenburg County up in Charlotte, they again have a goal, but nothing that's recorded that runs with the deed, but their goal is not to exceed 50% development in parks and not to exceed 10% development in nature preserves. And these are all of their properties are actually owned by Mecklenburg County. They're not providing grants for others to purchase those properties. In the city of Groveland, Florida, for their traditional active parks, they impose a 50% impervious surface limit. Active parks, I interpret those as baseball fields, football fields, soccer fields, tennis courts, parks with gymnasiums and larger buildings and things like that. Theirs was just a little bit confusing because I think what they were reporting on was that their own parks, but then there are also different zoning designations that have limits. So the next one is recreation and open space, which are lands, I believe, that they actually own. And they limit development in those to bike and pedestrian trails with minor support facilities like restrooms and picnic shelters and things that we've discussed. Then they have conservation lands that they don't allow any buildings on. These are publicly owned. They can be privately owned also, if I read that correctly. And they have a 50% impervious surface cap. And then there's a conservation overlay or zoning designation that they call out as CON. Those can be private or public, and they limit those to passive uses only. So I took these conclusions and recommendations, the first 2 bullet points, directly from Chuck's conclusions and recommendations section. And he just summarized that very few are applying a standard numeric cap or limit on impervious surfaces within their conserved and protected properties. But ultimately, the reasons that we are looking at imposing those are still valid. And then I've got a star down there because it seemed clear to me in our peer programs that active parks, athletic type parks, are treated differently than passive parks and conservation areas. 50% seemed to be a pretty standard cap from those that reported back to us. So I'm just posing the question here, should we consider breaking out active parks from any standard impervious surface caps that would then apply to fee simple passive parks, passive park facilities? And with your permission, I'll go ahead and run through what I've updated based on some of this research and comments as far as what his staff is recommending, at least as a starting point for impervious surface caps. And then perhaps we can come back and address that question regarding treating active parks differently from passive parks. So at the last meeting, Get my laser pointer going here. This slide that I have up now, this was the same slide that was presented at the last meeting. Hopefully it's a little easier to read, but this was the initial starting point recommendation for how we would tier parcels of various acreages to have different percentage caps on impervious surfaces. And the general idea is that smaller parcels are going to have a higher percentage, and the larger the parcels get, the smaller percentage would be implemented. So it's generally a trend moving this way. And I know at least one comment we had felt like that 15 acres was way too much for any parcel. So I did take that into account in our updated recommendations here. So one of the main issues that I kind of went down a rabbit hole on was whenever you change the actual percentages, in this instance from 25 acres and then you go up to 25.1 acres, the 25.1 acre parcel would be allowed half of the impervious surface, or 0.75 acres of a 25 acre parcel. So I made an effort to try and not have that trend regress back down, because that's just, to me, is illogical to have something that's 25.1 or 25.6 acres being allowed less impervious surface than a 25 acre parcel. So how I handled this was I took the ceiling from the previous tier. So if you're looking at 25.1 acres, 3% of that would be 0.75 acres, or 3/4 of an acre. But to avoid that regression, I bumped the minimum in that category up to the ceiling of the previous category. So 1.5 acres here. And that's the same all the way down. You can see the difference between a 100-acre parcel and a 100.1 would actually lose an acre on the 100.1. So then the ceiling from the prior category is implemented to make it a 3-acre impervious surface cap. There was a question also last meeting about would these limits cover existing or just new impervious surfaces? And a quick check of conservation easements, they go ahead and add in all the impervious surfaces that are there and then set a cap that includes those impervious surfaces. So new impervious surfaces are the difference between the cap and the existing impervious surface limit. So under this scenario, it would include all impervious surfaces on the property, whether they were there prior to the Greenbelt being involved or implemented after the fact. There was also a recommendation from Vice Chair Haygood to take this matrix and apply it to some existing properties that we all might be familiar with. So I went through and picked 6 of these. First one is Full Faith Ministries Park, and this is located on Johns Island, just off of Main Road, about a mile south of the Limehouse Bridge. It's a passive park, and I picked this one because this is one of the very few that you all in council did implement an impervious surface limit on, and that was 10,000 square feet on this property. So that's about 2.4%. Under the new matrix, this would fall under the 6% threshold and allow about an additional 15,000 square feet, or 0.58 acres total on that 9.6 acre parcel. The next one is the Edisto Youth Recreation Property. This is 145 acres on Edisto Island. And they, in their grant application and their grant agreement, it includes active, passive, and agricultural uses with a recreation center, that's an indoor building, and a library. And the limit that was imposed on this is 126,000 square feet of impervious surfaces. It was implemented through the conservation easement that's held by Edisto Island Open Land Trust. and was not funded with Greenbelt funds. But nevertheless, what we see here is that when you apply the proposed matrix, it comes out to be 126,324 square feet. So we're just about dead on that one. Next is the Jefferson Track. Thought that was familiar since we discussed that the last two meetings. It's 292 acres in Allendale, and it's a passive park. This 292 acres would make that one fall under the 1.5% cap, which would equal 4.38 acres. But due to the minimum, that would be increased to 5 acres because this one falls into the 250 to 500 category. And we're bringing it up to this 5 acre threshold from the prior category. Next is Wide Awake Park. That's 7.2 acres. It's a passive park. Under the new matrix, it would be allowed, it would fall under the 6% threshold because it's under 25 acres. And that would allow for 0.43 acres. And I did include an aerial shot of the park here. And I went into GIS, and it's not super accurate, but it gives us a fairly close idea of how much impervious surface they have there now. I measured the concrete and this around this building and included this building that's part of Wide Awake Park, as well as another very small building over in this area. And it came out to be 0.33 existing acres. And under our 6% cap, we would allow for 0.43, which would allow Wide Awake Park 1/10 of an acre additional impervious surface. So if they came and said we want to add a picnic shelter or something like that, assuming this were a new project that fell under the new cap, then we would say, well, you can do what you want, but you've got 1/10 of an acre to work with. And if you want to exceed that, you have to come back to the GAB and County Council and get approval for that. Next is Pinkney Park on James Island. It's a passive park, 7.37 acres, again falling under the 6% cap, which would allow it 0.44 acres. With the impervious surfaces they have now, they're at about 0.07 acres of impervious surface. And those are this picnic shelter here, or maybe a restroom building, and picnic shelter over here in the corner. And just a note, this parcel right here is also part of the park. It's both of these parcels. So under the new proposal, they would have about 0.37 acres remaining for impervious surfaces. And what I did was I measured, there's also an ADA space right here that's included in their current impervious surfaces. So I measured their driveway and parking lot, as well as what is now a pervious path that runs through this part of the park. You can see it pop in and out of the trees here. If they were to pave that driveway, all of their parking lot, and that path, that would equal the amount of impervious surface they would have left. So about 0.37 acres to pave parking lot, driveway, and their trail that goes through the park. And then they would be maxed out on the impervious surfaces that would be allowed under a standard cap. And that's all of my slides for my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all may have.
Well, Eric, based on what you've learned and talking to Chuck, do you think it would be reasonable to publish the guidelines that can you go back to your guidelines slide? Do you think it'd be reasonable to publish that as an expectation, given that most people or most applicants might, if they want to deviate, they're going to ask to deviate anyway. Like if we made this formal, they're going to ask to deviate, right, to the gap, to the greater gap. So if we publish this as an expectation, then it would kind of be on us to, as an applicant rolls through, to just say, well, we're going to apply this to this application, or we appreciate the fact that you've included this in your application, and yeah, we're going to stick with that, with the recommended limit. Basically case by case, but it's kind of laid out for you, and they have to address it up front if they want to deviate. Do you think that would be a reasonable approach?
The way I would envision it would be that this would be standard, this would be in the application. So whenever we ask that question about, when they put their acreage in, it'll say, under our standard guidelines, you are allowed this many acres of impervious surfaces. Do you want more? Would you like more than that? And if so, then you make that justification in your application, and that's up to you all in council to decide if you want to allow an exception to the standard cap. So again, this is just to ensure that all properties have some cap, because that really helps us out down the road when folks come back to us and want to add additional features to the park that may have not been specifically listed in their application and grant agreement.
Okay, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so the first thing I was thinking about is a discussion about kind of this range in the context of what we've learned from Chuck, our peer organizations, and the application, the sample applications you've done. And so I'd love your thoughts on that and everyone's, because it seems to me that what we're seeing is a wide range of application, that this range seems like it could be right for some, but it really doesn't hit it right for others, which to me amplifies why the other peer organizations haven't come to a conclusion on that, which is that it's very hard to standardize something that is so unique to each property. And, I look at it in just kind of my first glance in reading it, and based on the information that Chuck gave, something like Jefferson that's, applied as a passive park, that seems like a high threshold for them as a standard if you apply it there. For some others, it doesn't, so with the actual application of the range you've suggested. So I'm wondering, for you all as staff, what we want to do is make sure we make it easier for you all, that it's not the Wild West on every application. And in looking at this, for you as a staff, do you feel like we need to tweak that, your recommendations, or do you feel like we should do something different, have a standard that is an expectation like Chicago Open Lands does versus an actual clear guidance? I'm curious what you learned as staff on that.
So I guess I'll say again that I feel like most of the programs we were compared to are not exactly the way we handle it. A lot of times when they have a kind of a recommendation, that's when they're owning the property and they have control over the property. So I think I would stand by what we've proposed at this point, certainly open to tweaks if you feel like, certain scenarios are way out of whack with what you expect. And we discussed this also as a staff previously. I think you're going to get I don't think everyone's going to come in automatically and say we need more impervious surfaces. I think there's going to be some cases like with Pappy's Island too, where you've got the Open Space Institute as the applicant, and it'll be transferred into the Cape Romaine Preserve. I think they would say, that's way too much impervious surface. We want to lower it. I think we could tweak it, over and over again and bring it back, and we're still probably going to find some outliers that we're not quite comfortable with. But then I also think that puts it back onto the board when those situations arise to, you always have the ability to make that recommendation for a tighter or looser impervious surface cap, whether they ask for it or not.
Mr. Jones.
I tend to agree with the chair and the staff that I think that we're not suggesting that this should be hard and fast. I would say that it's sort of a guideline more than anything else, and as such, I would be happy to see it implemented. And again, our vice chair said, hey, what are other people doing? They don't seem to be doing much, so maybe we shouldn't touch it. Hey, don't you know who we are? We're the leaders in Greenbelt legislation or whatever. Then I'd be happy to go out there and lead and sort of put some sort of limit or a suggestion of guideline into our Greenbelt plan. I wouldn't be concerned. And I know this is not appropriate, it's limited appropriateness, is that one thing that impressed me about the submission by Chuck, I never realized it. Maybe you folk certainly did. I didn't realize the draw that existing vegetation and trees had on the water that was on a particular property. I thought it was significant, but I didn't realize quite how significant it was. And it struck me that, reducing the impervious surface is certainly very significant. So the lesser, the better. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? And just a reminder that any discussion has to be preceded by a motion, but yes. Christine.
I guess not so much a question, but just some comments. I'm thinking of this, and you've already kind of thrown it out there with respect to active parks, that this is probably not practical at all for an active park. Whether it's something that's, just a 2.5 acre site and all they're trying to do is build a basketball court or something like that. But even your larger ones, by the time you get to a larger active park, you've got plenty of field space, baseball fields, football fields, whatever. But those are the kind of things, the larger they are going to necessitate a parking lot and paved driveways. And I think that it's something as limiting as a 6% just can't be accomplished on an active site. So I think that is too hard for too high of a threshold, I guess, to use your words, there for anything that is an active site. Those active sites also, because of the paved surfaces, are already going to have to put in all the stormwater to offset the impervious surface that they're putting in there. So that's already being addressed because it has to be. So I've got some concerns, in particular with those types of situations.
Well, Eric, would you feel comfortable going back and making some kind of active park additional, element, additional suggestion?
I think that would be easiest done just by pulling out active parks from this specific matrix and you all helping determine what you feel comfortable with as far as that limit. From the Chuck's paper, it seemed like 50% was a pretty standard limit on those active parks. I think one was, no more than two-thirds of the park has to remain in a natural state. So somewhere between a third or 50%.
Christine, what do you think about that?
Maybe. As Elizabeth said a second ago, everything is unique, and so we don't know what we're going to get presented with. So it's just kind of off the cuff. Maybe that's reasonable. I'd probably like to look at it a little bit more, or talk to you a little bit more about it, Eric, when it comes to that. And one clarification, because we did talk about it last time, this would not apply to a corridor, is what you, I believe, said last time, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Fee simple non-corridor projects, and if you all decided you wanted to pull active parks out of that as well, then it would not apply to those.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think that that Christiane's raising a good point here. I think what we might see are hybrids that come in. Take for example, Edisto Rec, which is part passive, part agriculture, and part active. That becomes very onerous to decide. The easement's going to dictate, because that has an easement in there, but you're going to have a very complicated. You could make this unintentionally very complicated when you're going to have hybrid applications to preserve opportunities for the applicant. Then you've got to make some arbitrary decisions. at what point does passive apply there? What, is this passive, is that that? They may not know that at the time of the application in terms of which areas are more, wet or dry, those kind of things. I can imagine an unintended consequence getting a little complicated like that, because if that's the case, that then makes me wonder, and these are questions, I'm kind of drawing this out as a conversation, not a position, but makes me wonder, maybe that is the reason that our peers haven't come to this conclusion, not because they're not bold enough to make a clear stand on open lands, but because its unintended consequences are that it's more onerous on the staff and may complicate more than simplify and clarify. And so I still have questions about that because I'm not sure that we're there yet on that. I'd like to see the distinction if you pull out our active parks and kind of look at it like we're talking about from that classification. That might help in our discussions of that too.
Yeah, Jason.
I would concur with all of that. So a couple of notes that I jotted down for, fee simple urban parks in the urban setting, very rarely going to have 25 acres. Okay, right? And then you get net versus gross land acreage, what's wetland, what's critical area. That all has a pretty large impact. If you have a 1 acre parcel and 2/3 of it is critical area or wetland, then you start getting down in the weeds on this thing, and it really makes it complicated. And then you got zoning regulations and stormwater requirements that when, for instance, if there's an application, well, specifically like the Ross Tract, it's a Johns Island Park expansion, right? When we applied for that land, it was to accommodate for a future rec center, maybe a pool and some courts. Well, there's associated parking based on zoning requirements. And then we have to meet our stormwater manual requirements. So you're starting to put multiple layers of restrictions and they're not all going to work together. So when you start getting under the weeds on this thing, it's going to take a lot of work by somebody to really, I hear everybody talking about, you don't want it to be too onerous on the staff, but it's going to be onerous if we start, placing these sorts of requirements on projects that really is about purchasing dirt.
Okay, thanks. We probably need to move on. We got a bunch of other topics to hit on. Are there any final comments or questions for the
I
staff on
just
this
have
one?
one final
Okay,
one, just
yeah.
to be clear, as we're talking about the weeds here, I still feel very strongly that we need to have a expectation at a minimum that these are mostly, as Jason is saying, dirt, open, this is land, and that limiting impervious surfaces is a goal, is important, but we're talking about the how. So I don't want to come across as not supporting the overall goal, which is the right way to do that. So.
Yeah, so right.
And I think there's been a lot of great conversation around this today, but, the urban areas are certainly a distinct, a little different scenario in there. And I do think there's probably a reason why a lot of these other places haven't tackled this in terms of that. There's a lot of people out there that I always think, have been doing this for a long time. And it's maybe these things become goals versus hard and set in stone or something of that nature. And we figure out how we deal with the urbanized areas versus the conservation side and things like that nature. But it may be that it's turned more into goals than they are hard and fast rules. Because everything, we've already seen changes in the program since we started this. Warwick, we've been here a long time dealing with this stuff, and you've seen even some of the lands have adjusted and they've become more urbanized as the area grows and things like that were in more rural areas at one time. So it's an ever evolving process, and I think we just need to maintain as much flexibility as we can.
That all sounds good. And whether guidelines or expectations, whatever, I think the data you brought forth is really helpful. So thank you for that. I would also say let's move on to the next topic.
I have a clear directive on what you want me to bring back. What I've heard is look at our active parks, see how many active parks we have, what the acreages are on
Or
those.
maybe just pull them out. altogether.
But I think Elizabeth asked for next meeting to kind of like we provided some scenarios with these parks, do the same with our active parks. And that's what,
That's what I'm talking about.
For the subcommittee that's going to meet before we meet again, could we apply this just to see how it works? And just so the subcommittee knows how, where is this falling in? I don't think it's a requirement that a go or no go, but I would like to know, okay, if they come in here and it exceeds what we're looking at here in these guidelines, that's a conversation we need to have in the subcommittee with the applicant. How do you mitigate this, or why are you exceeding the impervious? I think that to me just lets the applicant know that we are concerned about impervious features, and so they would then come prepared to talk about that instead of saying, well, it looks kind of high, come back next time. And I'd rather just be able to have the conversation so we can move those applications forward.
Eric, would it be
Would that
possible to
work?
bring that measurement relative to the next applicants at the subcommittee meeting?
absolutely.
See if they comply. I mean, it seems like at this point, we can't go back and ask them to redo anything, but you could at least measure it.
Yeah, I think we could just, tell what tier they would fall under and how much impervious surface they would be allowed if this were implemented in a hypothetical scenario.
And if they exceed it, then I would go back to them before we have the subcommittee meeting, just to let you know the subcommittee may ask you about this because what they're looking at as far as a guideline, not a restriction, because that would just give us a chance to have a larger conversation.
All right, Eric, do you have enough to go on?
I would just say, since we didn't ask the question up front on the applications, we wouldn't have any information on what they're planning as far as impervious surfaces. But we could certainly just say, we're working on this, we'd like some feedback from you. Let them know what, if this were implemented, how much impervious surface they would be allowed without a special exception, and that we're going to
Doesn't the
discuss.
application say how much impervious area they're going to, it doesn't, okay.
No.
Thought it was in there.
We're not in a position to really make a big deal out of it with them right now, but we can measure it and then we can talk about it. And then if we want to ask them what they're up to on a particular element, we can do that. And we could also make a, case-by-case recommendation that they limit it relative to what we now think of as.
Always have that option of a special condition recommendation, just like you implemented for the Full Faith Ministries part.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. So thank you for that. Let's move into forward spending limits.
Again, this is just another slide that you've seen a couple of times now. And this shows current balance for each municipality, as well as their lifetime balance through the end of the program. Mainly have this slide in here if we need to refer back to it during discussion. This is also a repeat slide. I know we considered 5% may be a good option out of the ones presented because it's roughly equal to 1 year's allocation. So a municipality would not be able to forward spend any more than 5% of their remaining lifetime allocation. And this tells what each of those numbers are. Same with the rural down here at the bottom. Mr. Scarden, you asked to bring back some more information on rural revenues from the past, and there was a concern that maybe there needed to be some type of floor that the rural funds could not drop under to fund urban projects. So in case a large rural application came in, we'd make sure those funds were there that would be able to fund it. And after looking at that, I could foresee a scenario, for instance, where North Charleston and Mount Pleasant apply to utilize all their funds on hand plus borrow 5% of their remaining lifetime allocation. That would be about 10.8 million. So that would be a pretty big chunk out of rural. There's over 15 million in there right now, but it may not always be that way. So after looking at that a little closer, Mr. Scarden, I think that may be a good item for discussion. And this is the information you requested. I know you asked for the last 5 years of funding on rural projects. That's all the way back to the beginning of the program. And the total average per year is about 5.5 million. Now, there were no funds to be allocated, I believe, in 17 and 18. That was kind of the transition over to the second sales tax. If you take those 2 years out, then the average comes up to 6.4 million. And then the average per year since we started pay-as-you-go with the second sales tax, and now first sales tax, what remains in that is pay-as-you-go as well. The average there for 19, 20, and 21 is 2.6 million. And then I also took our most recent estimates for future revenues by year and average those for the rural area, which would be just over 6 million per year. Provided that information if you would like to consider a floor for the rural account.
What do you think? Thoughts? Questions, Mr. Jones?
I don't know, I've thought about this and there is a solution I have, but it becomes very complex when you start reducing funds back to present values and adjusting it, which I don't think would wear. But I suppose when I step back, I look, the people that suffer from this, or could suffer from this, are Mount Pleasant and North Charleston. So really, I guess my question is, are they happy with the pay-as-you-go system as we have at the moment? They are the ones that can suffer, that bear the risk that there may not be the funds there in future for their projects. But are they happy to wear that risk? And if they're not, then maybe we should address the question. But if they're happy for to go as it is, then let's leave it as it is.
Eric, are you or anyone from North Charleston or Mount Pleasant prepared to answer that question?
I believe that was directed at North Charleston and Mount Pleasant, sir.
Well, I'll try to give a stab at it. I mean, you know, when the decision was made not to bond and put the money up front, it's not there. And if we come up with a project, I know the city would be very disappointed if we said, well, there's not enough funds for you to do this project if I have the allocation available to me, or having the elevation of the city. So I mean, I know it's something we're gonna have to dance around a little bit, but I know sometimes we allow a lot of faith in Charleston County Council that they'll come up and do the right thing, because if everybody applied for a ton of money plus something, the coffers are empty. I don't think it's gonna happen, but it could. I mean, we're working on a fairly large project that'll wipe out all of our reserves at one swoop, plus a number of years into the future, and we'll figure out some way to pay as you go. But I know we'd be very disappointed to be told we couldn't move forward because the money's not there to provide to us, especially the amount of money we provide into the sales tax program from the citizens of North Charleston.
Well, so does that, Eric, does that just bring forth an idea of, if you go back a slide, relative to what your 5% max expenditure, does that just further cap it? Would that be one solution to this, is like further cap what is spent inside of that 5%? Like it can be 5% unless it hits this cap or something to that degree. Would that be a simple solution to this?
We may have to sit down and work on that together. I'm not quite following
Okay.
you there. What I think the big cap is that you can only spend the cash that we have on hand. So there's roughly 18 million right now cash on hand between urban and rural. So if city of North Charleston came in and said, we've got a $20 million project, well, we wouldn't have that much cash on hand to actually fund it. And that's when you go back to the bonding question.
Right.
We can only borrow the cash on hand.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I think, remember, there are other ways to have bridge funding that, if there is a big project, and City of Charleston has done that before, and those are possible. I think that's what Ray might have been alluding to. You can figure out some funding in an exceptional situation. And we can, I think we've talked about this last time, the importance of having the ability to look at this for exceptional requests. I think what we want to do is make sure you don't get into the situation you're talking about of somebody not having their allocation available to it, whether it's an urban area or whether it's rural. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid. I wouldn't support really, having to borrow from any of them. If somebody needed a borrowing in general, come to us with a funding plan that includes that temporary bridge funding so that they could catch up over time. There are ways to do that. That said, the 5% cap a year out seems to make a lot of sense. The other side of that is the smaller municipalities, the ones that have the hardest time using it because their allocation is below real estate values. I mean, it's very hard for them to use those dollars without trying to spend forward. So I would think that would be an exception you'd need to be able to look at, but it's also an inhibitor for them. But just remember that there are other bridge funding possibilities that don't require us to compromise our available funds long-term.
Any other thoughts on this topic? Or Eric, do you have anything to go on here? Probably not enough, huh?
But
Mr. Jones?
I don't know, you talk about other bridging. I mean, it's not so simple when you're a county to just step into the market and borrow. I mean, I'm not an expert, so I have an opinion, but that probably don't count. But to be able to borrow at a semi-government rate really needs for the agency or whatever to conform with certain standards. You maybe you can go and borrow at market rates, but if you're North Charleston, I don't know how long the market rate will stay below 2%, but the way inflation is, probably going to double the next 2 or 3 years.
You'd be
So-
in the market. That's private funding from either foundations or banks. The Conservation Fund does that. The Community Fund Foundation does that. There are special funds that exist for conservation projects specifically.
If I were North Charleston, I would say I'd rather have the Greenbelt funds at no cost than to pay 5% on any money that I borrowed.
That's right. So, I mean, that's all part of the factors to
Shouldn't
consider.
have to go through that. Because
Okay,
they're-
I believe the Fort Pemberton example was you committed funding for future years' revenues. You had borrowed some money, had some bridge funding for somewhere, and then each year, the county stroked a check to the city of Charleston, which went to pay your own creditor, correct? So I think that's how something like North Charleston would have to work. Because again, you can only use the cash on hand. You can't borrow forward past that without going through the referendum process that we
That's right.
discussed previously.
Okay, so Eric's got up the supermajority slide for iconic projects, but before we leave the 5% idea, do you have anything to go on there, or are we just going to bring it back up for discussion later, Eric? What do you prefer here? Do you?
I don't feel like I've been given any marching orders as far as this goes.
It might just be that we have to go think on it a little bit. But does anybody have anything they would like to see additionally from the 5% current staff recommendation? Or do we think, I guess if there aren't any questions, it might appear that would work until bonding.
I could have a flip question.
Yeah.
Well, statement. If North Charleston and Mount Pleasant came together with some major projects, that would solve the problem. Because there wouldn't be the surplus funds there.
And maybe we'll encounter that.
Anyhow, that's...
Yeah,
that's
but anyway, I think maybe we should pause on that. Why don't we talk about this supermajority issue for iconic projects, and we'll either double back at this meeting or double back at a later meeting on that 5% idea. It might be a later meeting, given that we might need to think about it. So why don't you carry on?
Okay. Ms. Haygood, you asked about a potential supermajority mechanism for if you did have an iconic or what we felt like was a very important project that needed to exceed that 5% cap. How would we go about that? So just provided some scenarios here on different supermajorities. There are 14 members of the GAB, so you can see what a 9-member, 10-member, 11-member Supermajority would equal percentage-wise, 64 all the way up to 86. I believe 67 up to about 90% is the range that I've seen for supermajorities with public bodies like yours.
I have to say, I thought this was already defined. We've had other meetings where we had some supermajority requirement in the past 3 years. Is that not, maybe that's a question for legal, but I swear I think it's come up before where we had to have a supermajority.
I can look at that. I know, and we'll get to this in just a little bit, there are very specific instances in the ordinance where we're talking about land conversions and transfers that currently require a 2/3 vote
There it is.
approval for the GAB.
Yeah. Yes, Francis.
So what is iconic? How do you know when it's iconic?
How do you, yeah.
I believe Boone Hall was mentioned last time, the Angel Oak. I think it's these large projects that are kind of a, this is your only shot type deal.
In some ways, I think kind of, you're right, that's, we might need to, specify that, but that might be part of the applicant, making that case for that. I think when I'm thinking about iconic projects like Boone Hall or Angel Oak, those have a community benefit that are probably bigger than just the pot of money they get from it, so Boone Hall and Mount Pleasant was extraordinary. That was kind of rural unincorporated, but you all contributed some of your, because it's an iconic project and it benefits more than just Mount Pleasant or that unincorporated area. It's a community benefit. Same with the Angel Oak. And there's a lot of judgment in that, but I think these are extraordinary, maybe another word for it, that just have a reach beyond their neighborhood or the specific funding pot that they're getting funds from.
So maybe the question back to you is, can the applicant defend it as an iconic project? So that's number one. And then wouldn't it also be reasonable, given that 2/3 has come up in our history, to just defer to 2/3? And maybe you'll have to ask legal later or something, but 10 members is definitely 2/3. So it seems like that would work. But that's just a question back to you mostly. As bringing forward next time as perhaps a recommendation, but is that any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I would say don't ask them to define it as iconic, because a lot of people are gonna say their project's iconic, and that puts us in the position of saying, no, it's not. You might not necessarily wanna do that. It's easier for us to say this is iconic than to go to someone and say, your project's not iconic. That's.
Yes, Mr. Jones.
Do we really need to define iconic if we're going to need a supermajority to approve the allocation of funds? I mean, you can suggest, I think this is iconic, and put it to a vote. I mean, the vote, if it's supermajority, in effect, defines whether it's iconic or not.
Is it not possible we're getting out of our sort of purview here? I mean, isn't that where council comes in, and they might, seems like we can put forth something, we think it's iconic, and we voted that it is iconic, and you should think of it this way, but isn't that a county council decision? That's a question to you.
Well, you're an advisory board, so everything you do is a recommendation to county council.
I think we should never leave anything to county council that we haven't intentionally tried to make a recommendation on according to our criteria and the standard of this program, because then it just opens it up for confusion and political stuff. And, there may be a situation that they ultimately they are always the final decision. We're just a recommending body, but we should do the homework of making the recommendation, in my mind.
But with the recommendation, if you're what you're talking about is allowing one unit to spend more than they have, it would seem to me that should be at least part of the recommendation, to say, we think this is such an important piece that we believe we should, break our own rules, or whatever the right language is, to allow this project to go forward, even though the funding's not there in that particular cities or areas thing. And that's something we just ought to attach to the recommendation. Because I think we also owe that, let them know that, hey, look, you gave us a set of guidelines. We think this project's good enough to waive those guidelines in order to approve this project.
So would it be reasonable, given that we have 2/3 history as a supermajority, to simply say, with a supermajority vote, we can deviate from the previous slide of 5% in favor of this project as a recommendation to council because we believe it's iconic? Wouldn't that be a reasonable approach? You can think about that. Or maybe, and y'all feel free to shoot me down if I'm off base on that. But
Why not drop my comment and just say exceptional?
well, whatever word you want, we're not defining it as it's not a part of the Greenbelt criteria precisely. Take any word you want, but it requires a supermajority to deviate from the 5%. If that is chosen at the 5%, can you go back a slide, please? If the 5% allocation is adopted, then to break it requires a supermajority. That's all that we're discussing here. That's really all this comes down to. And to break that rule that is also just a suggestion at this point, needs to be a supermajority. Then or not. Boone Hall worked out fine. Angel Oak ended up working out fine. That's for me, I think, but.
I think that what you're gonna find is that an applicant who's done their homework is gonna know where they're trying to get their money from. And you would have had conversations with them and saying, here's what's available. You actually do or don't have enough for that. And then they would have the responsibility of making a case that says, we think this is extraordinary because we realize that based on 5%, we'd only have this much. And so anybody who's done their homework would then make that case to us. And what we're saying, we don't have to get into the definition of all that, but because we have de facto done this.
Yeah.
In extraordinary circumstances, what we're trying to do is protect everybody has their allocations, protect these bases of funding so that no one gets way too ahead of that. So I feel comfortable looking at a 5%. I'm not comfortable making that decision today.
Right.
I'm also comfortable looking at the 2/3, the supermajority exception as a reasonable way to acknowledge that there would be exceptional opportunities that we might want to be able to override that 5% standard. That's just my view right now, and I don't think we need to.
I think it would be similar to the impervious surfaces.
Yeah.
If you implemented that, then there's a way to make an exception to it, but that's the standard.
Okay, so given that we need to move on to all these other topics, Eric, do you have enough to go on there to perhaps draft a staff recommendation based on what we've just talked about? Or we can talk about it again. Another time.
Yep. What I've heard is the 5%, you're not requesting any changes to that. You're asking for a recommendation on the supermajority mechanism.
Which may have precedent.
Just a point of clarification on the 5% piece. Are you proposing if you have to forward fund, let's say it's an urban project, are you going to exhaust all the urban funds before you then reach down into the rural funds? I think that's what we've done in the past. I just want to make sure that that's what everyone's thinking about here.
I haven't considered that.
Maybe we could get that answered by next time.
Okay.
Is it possible, Eric, to kind of do some scenario playing and running those numbers a little bit out? Because at some point, that's going to become relevant if you apply 5%, and that's a timing issue, kind of worst case scenario. And then we'd understand that, because I do think you don't want to compromise. That would definitely impact a majority vote if that were to impact, say, rural funding amounts.
Well, unless you put a floor.
Yeah, the
and
floor,
said,
if you say-
We're not gonna go below, because rural does have money. But I don't want it all to disappear. I don't think it's the right thing to do. So if you had a floor to say 6 million, so if a project came in the next year, we know the money would be there based on
Yeah.
historical
Yeah.
spending.
So you're suggesting perhaps a floor on rural or
Right.
urban?
Well, you would, the process would be if someone's gonna take 5%, you're gonna exhaust the funds out of the urban, if it's an urban project, before you would dip into the rural funds.
Right, okay.
Which is what we've done in the past. If you do that, then I think that, at least I would like to see a floor that says it might be 6 million or 7 million, whatever the one is. We're not gonna go below that, so we preserve.
That's what I was trying to ask before, actually. I don't think I said it quite right. And floor is what I meant. That
rural
rural
funds.
cannot get fully depleted.
And that was the intent of this slide, to try and help you all look at what that floor might be, which, going forward, we're looking at about 6 million per year being allocated to rural. So you couldn't borrow from rural to pay for urban projects once you hit 6 million in the balance for rural.
You will have exhausted the urban funds first before you go into that.
Yes, Ms. Johnson.
Would it be legal to do that? I mean, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but to dip into funds that are specifically allocated for rural projects to finance urban or vice versa would be against the way we've set up this Greenbelt financing. I mean,
We've done it.
We've already
We
done
did
it.
it.
okay, well, I still ask the question, though.
I think it wasn't, it was quickly recovered, but there was
That's a
about a
cash
year.
flow issue. It's analogous to cash flow. It's just managing your cash flow a little bit. You're not depleting it. And the only time you would is if it's in the last year and you kind of, depleted it beyond what could be replenished in the next year, or you had some extraordinary circumstances where it didn't get depleted. The safest way in that is you say you don't dip into rural funds. But that really becomes a cash flow management question.
Yeah, you could have a scenario where you have every municipality putting an application in, there's not enough money to go around, or just 2 or 3 of the large municipalities put that in. I was fairly surprised to learn that we allowed forward spending at all, to be honest with you,
I
when I
agree.
started here.
Ray.
I guess I'm confused. And certainly not trying to pry into the way the county handles its finances, but this is a pot of money. Just because it's distinguished rural or urban, I would assume if there was any kind of forward spending, the county just kind of dribble it along all the process. So am I hearing that they're physically taking it out of distinguishing one pot as rural and one pot as urban? I thought it was just one pot of money. It's the internal finances of the county. I never tried to pit the urban and rural in that kind of scenario. It's a pot of money that we're all vying for, and we're trying to figure out how we vie for it. So there's always money there available to get projects done. So I'm just curious. I just don't understand how the financing is being accounted for.
Jason.
Yeah, so Kathy used to always encourage us, if there's a project, go for it. And that there's a pot of money, and that pot of money is not, the pot of the bank account is different by definition than the allocations, right? So if there was a project that there was an opportunity to miss, and we didn't have current funds in the allocation, we were encouraged to go for that. So that, like Ray said, that there's a pot of money there, and then there's allocations. So I think it's maybe definitions.
It's almost like the wrong terms being used. Borrowing is not the right term. It is temporarily redirecting inside of 5%, which we have established is inside of 1 year's projected income or something to that effect.
It all comes down to cash flow and that scenario of you expend all your current cash on hand, but you still have projects you want to fund, and you can't fund those. I think that's the concern.
Nora, a question or thought on this?
It would have to be a really, really special project to get me to actually take money out of rural and give it to a municipality. for another project.
Okay. Well, I think at this point, 11:05, we should move on to the next topic. We've heard of some good thoughts on that. What do you have next, Eric?
Last meeting, you all suggested that we reach out to past applicants and our partners with the Greenbelt program to obtain feedback on different aspects of the program. So I wanted to provide a draft survey that I've come up with, and if you all approve it, then we'll get that out to our partners as soon as possible. The first three are just contact information. Number 4 is, what is your overall level of satisfaction with the Greenbelt program's efforts to communicate to stakeholders important information like program guidelines, meetings, calls for grant applications and grant awards, et cetera. All the questions that ask what's your overall level of satisfaction will have that the same selections at the bottom, ranging from unsatisfied to satisfied. And then we follow that up with an open-ended text question: how can we improve Greenbelt program communications? And we follow that same model for the remaining questions. So what's your overall level of satisfaction with the application process? How can we improve the application process? Level of satisfaction with the project application review and approval process. How can we improve that process? Overall level of satisfaction with the Greenbelt program project closing process. How can we improve that? Property monitoring process. How can that be improved? And then finally, what's your overall level of satisfaction with the program, and provide any other comments you may have. Do you all feel like that's going to give you the information that you're seeking?
I kind of weighed in and last month about this, but I really wasn't thinking of it in this way.
Okay.
I've not had any issues with the process, that I've ever seen for Mount Pleasant. Where I was more interested was actually the application itself and the ability to be able to provide some feedback, because I know we've discussed it with you and with Kathy before, the challenges with trying to, the application as it applied to a corridor project. And we would like the opportunity to give you some feedback on that, because I do think that there's some tweaks that could be made to the application itself. Corridor projects end up scoring very low, the way the scoring criteria works on there. So maybe there needs to be considerations, kind of like we did for the beaches. It's always great to put something out and see how you're doing. Are you doing a good job? And get feedback from people. I've been certainly satisfied. Mine was more directed towards the application, where I would like the opportunity for me or my staff to give you some feedback.
And I have been in contact with Liz Boyles, and they're compiling comments and questions as they are going through really the first corridor project that we've had.
Right.
And she said she'd provide all those at a later date.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to stay on this topic, would you like to see some different questions? This would be the time to ask that.
Perhaps. We could, as much with what I'm saying, communicate directly with Eric and the rest of the staff, and then ultimately probably bring that back to the rest of the GAB.
Okay.
I think some tweaks to the scoring criteria for the application for corridor projects.
Jason.
It says draft partner survey. What partners? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, last meeting we had some different ideas about that, but my recommendation would be all program applicants from the past, whether they were approved or not. And I think Mr. Todd Burke mentioned that as well.
That's right. Elizabeth.
Yeah, on that, kind of shifting a little bit in terms of review of our general scoring criteria. We talked about a number of times, actually, as part of this review process, looking at the aggregate scoring, kind of the overall, what got funded, what didn't, so we can kind of tweak it and have ultimately some guidelines that if you score X, that's kind of generally a good score. This is not so good score, and this is probably usually not going to get, if you score this way, you're probably not going to be funded. To actually use the record of how we've approved projects to give us an indicator of where they stand now. I'd like to see those numbers.
Okay.
And I think that's going to illuminate things like corridor. That's how we discovered the beach problem, that if they're scoring lower, what do we need to do to either make that a more comparatively relevant, process, or classify it differently?
And to be clear on the score, you're asking for the staff score or the subcommittee score?
I'd like to see both.
Okay. And Chair Moulton, you did mention last meeting when we discussed this for the corridor project specifically, instead of maybe changing the whole application scoring, that you come up with a kind of an average score for corridor projects, have its own range that you're only comparing corridor projects to other past corridor projects.
That's right.
I think that would be the simplest way to address that. Now, there are some changes on the application that need to be made if you check that it's a corridor project, because there's certain things that just don't apply and are confusing. So I'm with you on that.
It's the best way to protect our data up to this point too. Okay, any other questions for staff on the survey?
So is this something we do want to put out? Yes.
Yes.
That could be.
Because I was told we need to put this out and very soon so that you all can review that feedback as we're doing our 5-year plan review. That was discussed at the last meeting.
You want to make a motion?
Yes, I will move that we approve the draft survey and that it go out as soon as possible to get the feedback for the next time.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor, please say with an aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, so it's agreed upon. Next topic, park development deadlines.
Vice Chair Haygood, I believe this was one that you asked to bring forward at this meeting. Currently, there is no standard requirement for an applicant to implement park improvements that they outline in their application by a certain time. It's just really been handled on a case-by-case basis, and very rarely have those special conditions been implemented. We don't track exactly this exact data, so what we looked at, what we pulled from our database, were projects that had some degree, they indicated in their application that there was some degree of public access that would be provided in the future, and those applications that also included, as part of their match, funds for improvements to the property. Around 54 of our 115 fee simple projects have not opened to the public or implemented the significant improvements as outlined in their application. Now, a big chunk of these are some Charleston County parks, which we knew from the beginning that they were buying up land for way in the future park development, way down the road. And a good chunk of these are also City of North Charleston projects, where it's these small parcels along Noisette Creek and Philbin Creek where they have plans for future greenways. And those are being pieced together. And I believe there's some progress right now on the Noisette Creek Greenway, just from following North Charleston's Twitter account. But what we came up with is the average delay for those that we considered, have not implemented what they said they were going to do as far as public access and improvements in their application. Those that are still outstanding, the average delay has been about 9.3 years from the time that their project was approved by County Council up until today. And if you take out those Charleston County Park and Rec sites and the Noisette and Philbin Creek projects, and that drops down to about 7.5 years, with the maximum being 14.7 years, which I believe takes us all the way back to the first round of applications that came through. We do have some projects that have never implemented the public access or the improvements that they promised in their application. And when you look at those projects that did include improvements to the property as part of their match for Greenbelt funding, we still have about 3.7 million outstanding where they have not actually implemented those improvements. So I think we've talked about how difficult for impervious surfaces and forward spending it might be to implement standard caps or tiers of caps across the board. I think that each project is so unique when it comes to public access and improvements. This would be even more difficult to say every project has to be completed within 10 years. I would recommend that you still address these on a case-by-case basis, and really look at when you have concerns about the applicant's ability to implement those improvements or to provide that future public access, then that's when you start looking hard at special conditions. And maybe those are for first-time applicants or those that have an established history of not implementing their public access or their improvements as outlined in their applications. Or if they're utilizing future improvements as a big chunk of their match, because they do receive points for the percentage of their match. And if those improvements never happen, then, if we'd have known that from the beginning, those applications may not have been approved.
Wow. Any thoughts, questions?
But
Mr. Jones?
just the obvious, what are we going to do about the people that are tardy? Have we just been tardy in ourselves, in our policing? Is there something we need to do specifically now for the miscreants?
Well, it all goes back to their application, which is incorporated into the grant agreement. So that's what we look at. That's the governing document for the relationship between the county and the Greenbelt Fund recipient. And as noted, I could only find one instance where we've required, funds for development, which was part of their match for their improvements, that those be required, that show proof of those by a certain date. So we can't go back now and change grant agreements to say you have to finish this by a certain date, or the property is going to transfer to Charleston County or some other entity. This would just be for projects going forward.
Yes.
So the solution is to be more definitive in terms of timing?
If you have concerns about an applicant's ability to implement their improvements or public access, then I would put that on the board. You can always implement a special condition to require those to be on the ground or property to be open to the public by a certain time.
One possibility is that you automatically have an expectation that, say, within 5 years, just to pull that out of the air, that the grant agreement terms would be commenced, that the improvements would be used, and specifically if they're used as matched, and that you have a 5-year review that actually tests to see if they've done that, and that, we'd look at that. And that if they haven't done there's a reason for it, we'd certainly consider that. And this is something that staff would need to do. And at some point, we need to decide whether that needs to come back to the subcommittee or much less council, or GAB. But, I do think the possibility of a 5-year review and the possibility that if these terms aren't done within a certain window, that property reverts back to, I don't know if that's the county, the program, the proceeds to the program. I mean, I don't know how we do that.
That's
the
part
question.
That's part of the issue is, county's not really in the business
They
of
don't
owning
really.
Greenbelt properties. We don't have the staff to manage those. And I think that's part of the reason for the way the program's set up as it is. Those decisions would need to be made up front to say, if you haven't done what you said you're going to do as far as your improvements by a certain time, then this property is going to automatically transfer to another eligible entity, and you'd have to figure out who that is up front.
Personally, I'd like for them to come and explain why they haven't been able to do anything.
Yeah.
At least, maybe there's an embarrassment factor or something like that, or at least, because we did vote based on what they told us they were gonna do.
Jason?
So this is another hard one. You mentioned the original Greenbelt, right? The process for approvals for the urban projects was the PRC took our applications and they just assumed that the municipalities were applying for projects or land that fit their mission. I think it was almost a rubber stamp. So now we're in a scenario where the application process is a little bit different. As far as the city of Charleston goes, we don't have a crystal ball. Nobody knew a pandemic was coming, right? We don't know when hurricanes are coming. These all affect general fund expenditures in a municipality. We look at our Parks and Rec master plan, which we just completed, that looks out 10 years and identifies needs, but it also says you need funding. And without the funding, we can't start that clock. So when the big picture is that a municipality is looking at districts of land, if you will, the city does, says we know what we need in these areas. So I can't tell you that when funding is going to be identified by a city council and mayor to start a project. So that, the 9.3, 7.5, 14.7 max, the fact of the matter is that dirt is preserved for future public access in an urban point of view, and it'll never be developed. So it's land banked, if you will. There's desires for that land, but again, it comes down to municipal budgets and capital improvements, which it's very difficult to forecast. So this is not an easy one to really put a limit on, I don't think.
Well, the topic's been brought up. Thank you. I guess we'll have to all think on this one. In the spirit of time, why don't we try to hit transfers and conversion procedures?
Okay, just to be clear, what this is trying to clean up Ordinance 1424, 2 items in Section 5. And this is not transfers from one eligible Greenbelt recipient to the other, which the GAB can approve. This, in item G of Section 5, this is talking about actually taking a property out of the Greenbelt program and either replacing that with a property of equal value or paying back the Greenbelt fund with actual cash or a combination of both. As it reads now, this is where the 2/3 that you mentioned earlier comes in. This really harkens back to the bank board. But right now it says that there's a 2/3 vote of the board required after a finding of fact that the land no longer exhibits the characteristic that qualified it for acquisition with funds from the County Greenbelt Fund, and a majority vote of Charleston County Council. And then item I is similar to this, but this is actually for a change in use that was not identified in the application or grant agreement, but would still be permitted under Ordinance 1424. So like a community center or something like that, for a passive park, an active uses for what was originally identified in your application, your grant agreement as a passive park. And it has that same requirement, the 2/3 vote of the board following that finding of fact, and then a majority vote of Charleston County Council. Well, the issue that we've come across here is, as it reads now, if there's not a 2/3 vote, then it gets killed at the advisory board level. So it's not a recommendation you're making to council. It would actually stop that from going to council. And with you all being an advisory board, I'm recommending we update this ordinance. And I'm not sure about the 2/3 vote, why that came to be, or why we have that in here. But the recommended changes, what I have here on this next slide, where it would be a recommendation by majority vote of the board following that. And those are the only 2 changes. So just like a project reviews where you make a recommendation to county council, it would go to county council with either a recommendation to approve or a recommendation to deny, or say you had a 7-7 vote, then it would go to council with no recommendation at all. But council would have that opportunity to weigh in without it being stopped at the advisory board level.
Thoughts, questions, problems, motions? Yes, Elizabeth?
It's a question, it's a legal one. Is this a legal matter? I mean, to make it consistent with what our role is post the bank? Or is it possible that we could still make the choice to have it die here?
Mark, could you weigh in on that?
The purpose here is, as an advisory body, the goal is to have every decision that you guys make be finalized by county council. And so whether or not you recommend that a property remain in the Greenbelt program or be removed should be seen before council. And they will say either you guys said, yes, this is a good idea to get rid of it and replace with whatever, or no, it needs to stay with these parameters. Council should see that and either agree or disagree based on their decision, but with your guidance. And so the whole point is to make sure that any action that is taken, it is simply an informed recommendation to council.
Seems reasonable to me, but again, it's going to come up for a bigger vote later down the road anyway, so maybe we just move on to the next topic. You brought it up. Thank you. We see your recommendation, and we still have one more big topic to hit. So I would say let's go to criteria.
Okay, this should be a quick one. Several have raised concerns about level of public support and how that is scored in our application. So you can get a total of 6 points, and you select all that apply. As it stands now, you get 3 points if you have support letters or emails from the public. Typically, these are coming in from regional and national organizations that are involved in conservation. Results of a public hearing for 2 points. I've seen very few projects that have a true public hearing, so I don't really think that applies here. And then other, 1 point. Haven't seen any answers yet that really have qualified for that 1 point. So just trying to clean this up a little bit and recommend some changes. So the recommendation would be to change the 3 points to support letters and emails from individuals / grassroots organizations in the immediate project area. And I think this would incentivize applicants to actually reach out to the nearby community instead of just depending on the same letters from the same organizations that they provide with every application. And then favorable results of a public meeting / survey. As it stands now, it's just results of a public hearing, which, as I mentioned, we don't have those, and it doesn't speak much to whether the majority is in support or opposed to a project. And then support letters and emails from a regional or national organization would be 1 point. And that staff recommendation.
Thoughts, questions, comments? Taylor?
A little concerned about the survey, because I think nowadays you can do a Facebook survey. Does that count? And how many people, if 10 people say yes and nobody says no, is that going to get them 2 points?
Yeah, I think they would have to provide the results of that survey. And then, you could look at that in your scoring process to say, yes, that's a valid instrument for feedback from the public, or no, it's not.
Other questions? Mr. Jones?
So what if you have your survey and you have a massive amount of non-support? Can you have a negative point? You can't, of course, but I feel a little uneasy about this too. I'm not sure what I would suggest. But you can have support and not support.
And my thought would be if, we score these applications as well, and if results from a public survey were provided that where clearly the majority is in opposition to a project, then they would not receive those 2 points.
Other questions on this topic, or something language you might want to see different?
Just one comment on the first one, in the immediate project area, because, the project might be of a larger magnitude that, why couldn't it just be from the community in general?
Yeah, I think we can make those changes. I think we just want to differentiate between letters from folks actually on the ground and not just, we honestly get the same letters from the same organizations with every application, and then the box gets checked for support
So if
letters
it
and
could just
emails.
be from the residents, you
Yeah.
know, like I said, the project might be large enough that it'd be good to hear from, you know,
Mm-hmm.
broader than just the project area.
Sure. And then, of course, how do you define the project area? So,
right.
but just trying to differentiate between those form letters and true grassroots feedback.
Right.
And I would just say, you know, on the subcommittee, when we're looking at these, really scrutinizing them hard, and I think we all want to do that on every application at full level too. I've seen applications that come in with implied support that when you read the letter didn't give it, okay, and gave themselves the number. So I think you have to, no matter what, really look at the quality of what you're saying, and that would be on any of that, whether that's the survey's bogus or whether it's whatever. You got to dig on these to understand it.
With that in mind, do you want a language change here, or are you happy with the way
I
it's written?
support Christiane's about the community, making that first one, or letters, the important word there is individuals and grassroots within the community.
Okay, that sounds good.
I'm
Any
still
other
not a
language
fan
or
of
thoughts on
surveys.
this?
I'm
Pardon?
still not a fan of doing a survey. Unless we really tell them how they have to do it and what the requirements are, it's kind of wide open, and I think about some of the projects we had, and we had surveys, and I didn't feel good about it.
Yeah. Jason?
That's a great point. If we go back to the survey that was done when we started to reevaluate the Greenbelt program, in my opinion, that survey was issued and the questions of the survey were maybe focused, and there was a lot of detail, or there was a lot of support from the GAB gleaned from that survey. And again, you get on the internet and anybody can fill out a survey, but I know that in the case of the city of Charleston's Parks and Recreation Master Plan being completed during a pandemic, if we didn't have that ability to engage the public via SurveyMonkey, Facebook, and other means, our participation would have been a lot lower. So it's a necessary thing, I think.
Any verbiage change you'd like to see from staff relating to that? If not, Eric, do you have enough to go on kind of to make a couple of adjustments here? Okay, well, that's good. We just passed over the 90-minute mark. What, do you want to talk about these next meetings, Eric? Or anything to talk about there?
Yeah, just a reminder, if you're on the subcommittee, we'll be reviewing projects on March 16th, which is a typical Wednesday, but due to some scheduling conflicts, the second meeting, and we will need 2 meetings since we have 9 applications, the second meeting will be on a Thursday, which will be the 24th. And then, because we are right in the middle of reviewing these applications and site visits and subcommittee meetings, the GAB will not meet in March. And I propose that we do meet in April to review all of the application cycle projects. But spring break is the second week of April for Charleston County. I'll be here, but I know some of you may not be. So proposing that we move that to April 6th, which is the first week of April, and a Wednesday, your typical time slot.
I think once again, I would suggest sending that out by email, the greater GAB meeting, just to get a response. If you haven't, I don't think I've seen that, or maybe I have. Or we have.
I didn't want to get too far ahead.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Confuse
I know that is
folks.
some spring breaks, not counting schools, but it is some spring breaks. But anyway, we'll see.
So hang on, so the next meeting is when?
Currently, tentatively for April 6th.
Okay.
All right, anything else, Eric? Well, guys, we got through a lot of pretty weighty topics, so thank you very much. This was a really good meeting. And unless there are any other thoughts, we are adjourned.
Thank you very much, Pete.
See you, man. I gotta roll.